I'm Trudy Rubin, worldview columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer. I'll be talking with Harvard professor Joseph Nye, the man who coined the term soft power, a concept that's much under discussion as a key tool for President Obama in his effort to change the way foreign policy is conducted. I'm doing this interview in conjunction with the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science, in whose March 2008 issue, Professor Nye published an important essay on public diplomacy and soft power. Joe Nye has had a stellar career both in and out of government, having served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs and Chairman of the National Intelligence Council under President Clinton, among other posts, and as Dean of the Kennedy School at Harvard. He has also written noted books on leadership and soft power, but I'm especially interested in talking to him about how his theories on soft power apply to the Obama administration and to the foreign policy challenges President Obama will face. Professor Nye, let's start with a definition. What is soft power?
Well, power is the ability to affect others to get what you want. And there are three ways you can do it. You can threaten people with coercion, sticks. You can pay them, induce them, carrots. Or you can get them to want what you want. And that ability to attract people to get what you want through attraction is soft power. And the extent to which you can use soft power, you can save a lot on carrots and sticks.
In the Bush administration, there was a lot of disdain towards the very concept of soft power. I think Donald Rumsfeld once said he didn't know what it meant. And during that same period, America's image abroad went down, according to all the polls. So was Rumsfeld right? I mean, does it really matter?
Well, I think that it does matter. If you think of what the Bush administration tried to do with their hard power, including invading Iraq, we had become so unpopular in Turkey that the Turkish parliament wouldn't allow the 4th Infantry Division to go across Turkey and enter Iraq from the north. So the loss of our soft power in Turkey actually interfered with our hard power. And I think that's a clear case where Rumsfeld not understanding soft power was expensive.
So when my readers write me and they say, why should we care about public opinion abroad? They're missing something.
Well, they're missing something because public opinion abroad creates either an enabling or disabling environment. If being pro-American is the kiss of death for a foreign leader because public opinion is angry at the United States, the leader is less able to give the American president what he or she wants. So it does cost.
Is there a new relevance to soft power in an age where our biggest security threats are asymmetrical and come from non-state actors like Islamist terrorist groups?
Very much so. If you think of the threats that we face, many of them are ones that you can't deal with directly with military force. Take transnational terrorism. Yes, force is part of the answer. Somebody like Osama bin Laden, you're never going to attract him. You have to kill or capture him. But the key question is the mainstream Muslims. Is bin Laden going to be able to recruit them, or are they going to restrain themselves and not fall into his trap? And that's where soft power comes in. You can't prevail against transnational terrorism if you are taking positions which make it easy for the bin Ladens of this world to recruit from the mainstream.
I want to come back to that point of whether it's image or policy positions. But before we get there, I just want to talk a little bit about Barack Obama and soft power. You wrote that it's difficult to think of any single act that would do more to restore America's soft power than the election of Obama to the presidency. Now that he is president, do you see signs of a change? Is he beginning to do things that shift our image, change the symbols, and is there more you are waiting to see?
Well, as a top British politician told me right after the election, the United States is a unique country that, in the sense that by electing an African-American president, we changed our image in the minds of billions of people. And that did a lot to restore the American dream and make us attractive again. But Obama's going to have to follow that symbolism with policies. And if the policies are unattractive, the election alone won't be sufficient.
But you point to something which is the shift in America's image, and obviously the election of an African American affects that. But one of the areas where foreigners used to admire us and wanted to imitate us, and imitation being the key word here, is our economy. And I just came back from the Davos World Economic Forum, where the United States was the symbol of what not to do, and our very competency was in doubt. Has the economic crisis really affected our image and our ability to project a presence that other people want to imitate?
It clearly has been costly to us, not just economically, but also in terms of our soft power. The Wall Street model, which was the envy of everybody in the economic area, has collapsed. There are no more investment banks, for example. But I think what the long-run costs will look like depend on how well we both recover in terms of the real economy, but also what sort of framework we set up for regulation of the financial institutions. If in, say, 3 to 5 years we've done that well, I think we can recover from the losses that we've suffered in the last year.
Well, when you look at those aspects of America that people used to want to emulate, economy, culture, democracy, how does that stand now? For example, democracy. President Bush pushed democratization and famously in Iraq tried to impose it through invasion. Is our democracy, besides our economy, still an object that other people want to imitate?
Well, I think many people had their doubts during the Bush administration. They felt that the way we were treating civil liberties in response to terrorism, the presence of Guantanamo, these things called in question our democracy. I think the fact that we had an election in 2008 which led to such a surprise, I mean the fact that an African American with a strange sounding name could rise from nowhere and become president, I think that restored a lot of faith in American democracy. But the key questions are going to be whether we follow up on that election with other policies. I think President Bush spoke a lot about democracy. I'm sure he believed in it, but there's a big gap between a vision which is high-sounding but impractical and a vision which is something you can implement. I think President Bush's efforts to, let's say, impose democracy coercively were a failure, and that had a cost for us. To the extent that we support democracy and support civil society and groups in other countries who move in that direction, I think that's more natural and more likely to improve our soft power.
Do you think that Obama's announcement that he intends to close Guantanamo and that he will not countenance torture will have an impact, has had an impact?
I think it definitely has an impact. Now, there's still some hard questions left. What do you do with some of these people who are out to kill us? You can't just let them go. It's not clear you can put them through the normal court system. Some people say you can, others say not. But the one thing you can make clear is that there should be a situation where they have an independent judicial review, that the executive branch shouldn't be judge, jury, and executioner, and that in our tradition of separation of powers, having a framework after Guantanamo where people have some degree of judicial review is important for the values we stand for. And the same is true with the President's statements on torture. We tortured the word torture in the way we applied it in the Bush administration. And now we've got a pretty clear statement that, for example, waterboarding is torture.
And can you see signs that this is already improving or changing the way those abroad are looking at us as opposed to the way they did during the Bush years?
Well, there are some public opinion poll results that suggest positive reactions to this, but I think we're going to have to wait to see. Public opinion goes up and down. It's volatile. On the other hand, it does trend in, if you can take averages over time and see whether the trends that are short-run trends are continuous or whether they are blips.
Let's talk about how soft power can be used in practical terms and how it meshes with hard power, which is a combination that you call smart power. Let me just ask you to give an example. Say, how would soft power be relevant to Obama policy on Iran?
Well, Iran is not going to be solved by soft power alone. Actually, many things are not solved by soft power alone, North Korea being another example. But to the extent that you attract others and get support, you may contribute to the solution. So if American soft power is strong in Europe, in the Middle East, and other areas, we're more likely to get support for the kinds of sanctions that may be necessary to try to push Iran in the direction of making compromises on its nuclear program. And to some extent, the ability of the Americans to attract a younger generation inside Iran may help in the Iranian elections to produce a Hatami instead of Ahmadinejad, the current president. So soft power isn't the sole solution, but it can contribute.
And again, say on the question of reaching out to the Muslim world. On the one hand, we have the images of Gaza, which is linked to the United States via Israeli policy. On the other hand, we have President Obama making a speech or giving an interview right away to an Arab television station and promising soon, if not in his first 100 days, to visit a Muslim capital. Again, do you think soft power, well used in this instance, can make a difference?
I think it could make some difference. Our support for Israel is definitely going to be unpopular in many Arab countries, but it doesn't mean we're going to change that support. On the other hand, there are things we can do, such as the President has done with the interview on Arabiya, his statement about a visit and so forth, which can at least counterbalance some of the unpopularity of our view of supporting Israel.
One thing that has interested me a lot is the speeches that Secretary Gates has been giving about the need to complement hard power with soft power. You don't usually expect this from a Secretary of Defense. And he has been very adamant that there has to be a civilian complement to the military aspect of our power. He said recently on a speech that he wanted, quote, a dramatic increase in the civilian instruments of national security, among which he included diplomacy, foreign aid, civic action, reconstruction, and development. He also talked about strategic communications. I guess he means public diplomacy. Now, the Bush administration made a big priority of public diplomacy, but it didn't seem to win many hearts and minds, especially in the Middle East. How can we do better? What did they do wrong, and what should we be doing differently?
Well, Bob Gates's speech in Kansas in 2007 was really quite a remarkable statement. He said we have to invest more in our soft power, and that this may be odd for the Secretary of Defense to plead for resources in the State Department, but that's what we need. And I think he's right. The trouble with public diplomacy, I think, in much of the Bush administration was that they saw it as a spin or selling, and people become suspicious of that. If something looks like propaganda, people don't trust it. It loses credibility. You think of public diplomacy, it runs on a spectrum between telling and listening. And some of the most effective dimensions of public diplomacy are in the middle, where you have exchanges, where people are both listening and saying. And that, I think, is what Bob Gates is getting at, that there are a whole series of instruments, and that just spin or propaganda isn't the most effective. Or another way of putting it is the best propaganda is not propaganda.
Right. I mean, this certainly comes to mind when you think of the way that we've been reaching out to the Arab world in terms of communications. For example, Al Hurra, the TV station that we set up to reach out, doesn't seem to have made much of an impact at all.
Well, it seems to I mean, it has some listenership in Iraq. It tends to preach to the converted, but on my visits to the Middle East, when I've asked people who are basically pro-American, do they listen to Al Hurra, they tell me no. They just regard it as American propaganda.
Should American officials be appearing more on Al Jazeera, or certainly on Al Arabiya, the station to which President Obama gave that interview?
Yes, all of the above, including Al Hurra as well. But you can't restrict yourself just to our own wholly owned subsidiary. We should be getting out our message on many different forms of communication, including the stations you mentioned, but also using the internet more effectively.
I was going to ask you about that. Obviously, that's the medium that young people the world over are using, and jihadi websites certainly have a huge audience. Do we do enough to reach out via the internet to those audiences, young Muslims?
I don't think we have done nearly enough. It's generational. I mean, the large majority of the population in Muslim countries aren't going to be using the internet every day, but among the younger generation, who are the ones who are most vulnerable to recruitment, many of them do. And we have to be using the internet much more effectively to communicate there. Our enemies do. We've got to do better.
What's the problem? That's so obvious. Is it that we don't hire enough young people to work, or do we perhaps need a new agency dedicated to this? Should we bring back the U.S. Information Agency, which many people think was a disastrous mistake to disband, with those wonderful libraries in city centers around the world, and staff it with only under 35s?
Well, in principle, that might not be a bad idea, but in practice, it's going to take too much political capital. I think it was a mistake to abolish the U.S. Information Agency, but you spend an awful lot of political capital on reorganizing things. I think more effective is to make sure that we include a group of younger people who are attuned to the use of the internet in our public diplomacy efforts. If you go back to my metaphor about listening and telling being on a spectrum, that the internet fits very much in the middle of it, particularly chat rooms and blogs and so forth. These are two-way. And if we need a group of young public diplomacy officers who are adept at that.
Adept at it. You know, one of the areas where people admired us the most and wanted to imitate the most was simply in coming to the United States to study here, to go on exchanges here, or perhaps to immigrate here, or even to visit here. And as you know, one of the awful aspects of post-9/11 has been this clampdown on foreign visas, which has angered many genuinely fine people who want to visit here, have been treated terribly. The anti-immigration sentiment that has flourished, although not necessarily in the White House. President Bush tried but failed to get a better immigration bill. And a sort of pinched approach to exchanges. Are all of the above things that we really need to look seriously at, even though we're at an economic crunch time?
Well, there is a trade-off between security and openness, but we've erred, I think, on too much on the security end. When after 9/11, it's natural that we would have tried to close down on visas, though notice that the people who were here were not foreign students. I mean, they had another agenda. There are about 600,000 foreign students who come to the United States. The vast majority of them go home with much more positive views of the United States and can serve as people who can explain the United States. They're more credible when they explain the United States than we are when we do it through propaganda. So closing down on visas so that young people don't come here is shooting ourselves in the foot. And while we need to be careful about the security side of this trade-off, we sort of let the pendulum swing far too much in that direction. This is something that both Colin Powell and Condi Rice did something about. I mean, it got really bad after 9/11. Through their efforts, it improved somewhat, and we've now recovered to the level that we were in terms of student visas from before 9/11. But let's face it, a lot of people, when they arrive in the United States, the first people they see are border control people, and if they're treated rudely or badly, it leaves a very poor impression.
Just on this question of student exchanges, have you had cases with graduate students, as I've heard so often, from China or from the Middle East who went home for a vacation, couldn't come back again, got delayed, had to cancel their programs?
Yeah, we had several cases, particularly in the immediately after 9/11 and the year or two after. I've heard less of that recently. So there's been some improvement.
I know that in Iraq, Prime Minister Maliki has approved of a program to send 10,000 Iraqis to study here, or elsewhere in the West, and I'm hoping those visas will be available. Do you think this is a time when that could happen?
I certainly hope so. I mean, if we're going to be serious about having an Iraq which is stable and understands the United States, having young Iraqis who've spent time here and go back is very much in our interest.
I'm wondering about also the aspects of smart power that you testified about last April before Senate Foreign Relations. The whole question of using diplomacy more effectively is talked about a lot. But what does it really mean?
Well, one thing it means is more diplomats, more resources. I mean, this number that's been bandied about, but is true, that there are more military musicians than there are foreign service officers, is quite a statement. If you look at the military, it's able to take its best young people and give them a year of training, often in higher education. State Department can't do that. There's no float. It's stretched thin. We need more foreign service officers, and we need them to be able to handle not just political reporting, but also public diplomacy, science and technology cooperation. We need officers who can work on aid, reconstruction. So the first and foremost, I think, is more resources.
There has been talk of trying to staff a civilian response corps, to have civilians who are ready to go out in post-conflict areas and do all kinds of jobs that are now being done by the military by default. I've seen this a lot in Iraq, where the military is doing all kinds of development work, agricultural work. You have reserve units who come from agricultural states and are working with Iraqi farmers. They're very effective, but the question is this the right job for the military, and should civilians be doing more? What's your feeling about it?
I think civilians clearly need to do more, and this is, I think, what Secretary of Defense Gates was talking about when he said, please put more resources into these other civilian agencies. The Guard and Reserve do have capacity to do some of this work, but the main job of the military is to provide security, to provide order. And basically they need to have more of this job of deploying soft power, the development, building clinics, schools, so forth, done by AID, state officials, agriculture officials, and so forth.
Are civilians really capable, though, of doing these jobs? I have been in Iraq. I've been out to visit PRTs, so-called Provincial Reconstruction teams, which are made up of civilians, but basically have to be guarded by military when they go out when the situation is still dangerous. And I'm wondering, can you get civilian officials, whether it's State Department or Commerce or Agriculture Department, to take on such dangerous positions? are we in a period in history where more diplomacy on the ground by default has to be done by the military?
Well, in some situations, yes. You can't build a school or a clinic if people are shooting at you. So there's some situations where the military has to be in control, and where if there's any development work, it'll be done by military units. But the theory of counterinsurgency is that you provide security for the population, that you just don't go in and hit and run and then leave it and come back, but that you create enough military presence to provide stability and security, and within that framework, then the civilian workers can be effective.
So if we are looking at Afghanistan, for example, where there are all kinds of policy reviews going on, and there's actually a big debate over whether we should really be trying to improve institutions there, solidify democracy, do agricultural development, or whether we should be focused just on trying to prevent a return of al-Qaeda and tamp down the Taliban. And the same debate is going on about what we should do in Pakistan. Do you see a role for soft power in those instances, whether that soft power is exercised by U.S. diplomats or by U.S. aid workers?
Well, in Pakistan, where you have an effective military, the Pakistani military, they can provide the security in which you can have more aid going into development that produces soft power. Afghanistan's harder because there the security situation is much worse, and that while there's been a development of an Afghan army, it's still far too small to be able to provide that security. And that's why President Obama has talked about adding additional troops to stabilize the security situation so that you can have a framework where you can attract the hearts and minds of the population. I don't think you can turn Afghanistan into an American democracy through aid programs. You can, however, perhaps make the situation more stable by making the ordinary citizens see the American presence as more attractive at the time that you're trying to train up a larger Afghan army to manage the security situation.
Well, one of the proposals that I found the most interesting, and we touched on it briefly, is the idea of a civilian response corps. And there's a group of former senior diplomats, as you know, who has put together their idea of a new foreign aid budget, which would include a core group at state of about 250, I believe, but then there would be another couple of thousand who would be on standby from other departments, such as agriculture or commerce, to help with small business training, agriculture. If you had such a standing emergency response corps on the civilian side of our government, can you imagine they're being called on? For example, we're going to be sending more troops to Afghanistan. Can you imagine they're being called on to go, say, to the safer parts of Afghanistan with teams of diplomats, agricultural workers, what have you? Is this something that would be an important exercise of soft power?
I think it would be, but again, with the proviso that there has to be enough stability provided by the military that they can do their work. I think having a civilian corps of this sort is an important capacity. We have to think not only Afghanistan, but who knows when the next East Timor or some such situation will arise, and the capacity to not only stabilize through the military, but to create a civilian response team that can help develop a broader source of support is an important capacity.
When you were talking about smart power, using hard and soft together wisely in your testimony at Senate Foreign Relations, you were also talking about foreign aid per se. And as you know well, the foreign aid bureaucracy in the United States was sharply cut in the last couple of decades. And some describe what we have now as capable only of issuing contracts to big American Beltway bandits. And of course we saw that in Iraq, where mainly what the foreign aid personnel were doing, U.S. foreign aid personnel was signing huge contracts with the names we know so well, whether it's KBR or what have you. Should we, can we start reconstituting our foreign aid apparatus, and what would be the effective soft power or smart power way to use it in the future?
Well, I think you're correct that basically aid has shrunk to being just a simple contracting agency. That's a little bit exaggerated, but it's been decimated in terms of the personnel. I think we need to have a greater capacity in aid, and I think that building that up may be something that the new administration will want to look at. In terms of how effective can they be, it'll vary from with situations. The aid is some places where it's been quite effective, other places less so. But it's also worth noticing that over the last decade or so, more and more of our aid has gone through the military, not through civilian agencies, partly because of this shrinkage that you mentioned. So I think numbers I remember roughly were that about, I don't know, 14 or 15% of aid went through the military a decade ago. Now it's about 24%. And that leads to a militarization of foreign policy. And I think that when people look at American aid, it's better if there's more of a civilian face on it. I mean, some military aid is a good thing, but I think in general, we don't want to have it simply as a military program.
It's interesting, isn't it, though? It seems like often the places where aid is most needed are the places where it's hard for civilians to go.
That's exactly right. That's why you're often going to have closer coordination between the military, which is providing the security and may provide the first segment, if you want, of Reconstruction, but then wants to get on with the rest of its job elsewhere, and that's when the civilian aid people will have to pick up the role.
You talked also in your testimony about the advisability of the U.S. to try to strengthen multilateral organizations. And certainly the Obama administration, Obama himself in the campaign, talked about wanting to do this. And yet, when you look at the situation with multilateral organizations today, it's hard to figure out exactly how the U.S. is going to play that leadership role. For example, in economics, again at Davos, people were all now talking about the G20 or maybe a G30 instead of the G7 industrial nations plus Russia, which had come to be seen as the organizing principle for the international economy. The IMF is overwhelmed, doesn't have enough money to help out in this international crisis. The World Bank is trying to find its footing. And so in the old days, the United States, which was the most powerful player in those organizations, would have been called upon. But now the U.S. is being called upon to cede power and perhaps to help in redesigning these organizations, but not necessarily to act as even the first among equals. So how does the U.S. go about using smart power on the economic scene when on the one hand, everyone talks about the need for new Bretton Woods and new institutions. On the other hand, everyone seems to want economic revamping by committee, which, as we know, is not an effective way to get things done.
Well, for one thing, you have to realize that there will be a wide spectrum of institutions. Some will be useful for some purposes, others useful for others. I think the G20 is useful for some things. The G7 still will be useful for others. On environment, for example, some people suggested what they've called an E8. You can get 80% of the CO2 emitters by essentially having 8 countries if you treat the EU as one entity. So we're going to need a spectrum of institutions, not just one. But in that spectrum, we're going to need to do more to bolster the World Bank and the IMF. The Europeans are going to have to give up some of their quotas in the IMF. We're We're going to need to get more resources for the World Bank. This is not necessarily the U.S. giving up power. If other countries and other economies become more powerful, that can be good for us. It can be win-win.
But what's the U.S. role in all of this? Because these institutions are not going to automatically redesign themselves. And as we've seen in this economic crisis, for example, the Europeans can't even agree within their economic union on cooperation between banks. So what's the U.S. role in helping in this transition to new international economic institutions, which include players who haven't been included before, like China and India? Do we take the lead? Are we the power behind the scenes? How do we exercise smart power when we are now a big part, or the biggest part of the problem? People are looking at us askance, but on the other hand, it's not clear who else is going to take the lead.
Well, I think the U.S. has to take the lead. There's a proposition in economics about public goods, which are things from which all can benefit, which is that if the largest player doesn't provide the public goods, they're not going to be provided because the others will be free riders. And the United States is going to remain the largest player for quite some time, I would say decades. And that means it's very important that we take the lead. Now, taking the lead doesn't mean telling others what to do, bossing them around. It means that you say, we're prepared to cooperate, we'll listen to your views, but the United States is going to push this forward. And so I think the U.S. leadership remains as important as ever.
And that includes on climate change?
It very much includes climate change. In fact, if the U.S. doesn't help take a lead on climate change, it's not going to get done. We are, I think, well, China has now surpassed us as the largest, but we're very close behind China. And I think in that sense, the last 8 years, our failure to lead in this area has meant there hasn't been adequate progress.
And what about on the issue of free trade, where one can see protectionist impulses rising everywhere, including in the U.S. Congress?
Well, it's very tempting in a period of unemployment in any democracy, including this one, to say, take care of me first. But the trouble that we know from history is that when you succumb to that protection, others retaliate. And when they retaliate, there's a downward spiral and everybody's worse off. There's a study done by the Fred Bergston's Institute for International Economics, which said that the number of jobs that would be saved by, say, a Buy America clause in the stimulus package would be, I don't know, 7,000 or 8,000. And the number of jobs lost when other countries retaliated by passing their own Buy Europe or Buy China clauses would be even greater. And so avoiding that beggar thy neighbor approach is going to be essential. Not easy for a politician to explain that to his constituents, but very important.
Well, when you're looking at the role that you would like to see President Obama play in terms of utilizing soft power or smart power, I was struck by something that Richard Armitage said at the hearings, and you've quoted him, which is that after 9/11 we started exporting fear, I'm paraphrasing, and he would like to see us start exporting optimism and hope. That was the role of the United States after World War II, when you had a weary and broken Europe, and the United States exported hope and also money, economic aid, and good economic ideas, cooperation. How do you see the U.S. role now? Can we export hope when we ourselves are at a doubtful and self-doubting period in our history? Is that something that Obama has the experience and gravitas to do? And how important is it?
Well, I think if you look at his campaign, he was quite good at telling the American people, we have serious problems. We've got to give up childish things, in the words he used in the inaugural address. But there is hope. If we pull together, there is hope. And that position of the United States as what Ronald Reagan called the shining city on the hill, that's a very important source of our soft power. We've got real problems. We're going to have to buckle down and deal with them. But optimism is an important asset. And I think as a leader, Obama's been pretty good at that. He's warned people it's going to be tough, but he's also said, we buckle down, we're going to be able to handle this. I think that's an essential part of leadership. I've just published a book called The Powers to Lead that looks at how you use hard and soft power by individual leaders. And Obama's very good at that. I mean, I've been struck at how he's good at combining hard and soft power and projecting a sense of vision and a sense of hope.
In a way, we've entered a new period in the last 4 months or so that I'm curious whether it shifts any of your thinking on all your writing about soft power, because so much of what I've seen, read, your testimony, your articles, came at a period when we were still an object of imitation, even during the Bush administration, for our economic prowess, for our competence, for our ability to organize. Now those are under question because of the economic crisis. And at the same time, Obama is trying to recoup from policies that also led us to be criticized abroad. So are we still an image, are we still a country that others want to imitate? Are we still a place where people dream of emigrating to? How would you describe the United States now in terms of those qualities that still attract the world and are the essence of what you laid out as our soft power?
Well, I think the United States still is the country which stands for openness, for opportunity. The American dream is that you can be something better than you were or than your parents were. I think that still remains possible. It's worth putting this in a little bit of historical perspective. In 1989, when I wrote the book Bound to Lead, in which I coined the term soft power, there was a widespread belief the United States was in decline. People were very pessimistic about the American future.
Japan and Europe.
Yeah. And when I looked at American military power and economic power, I said, you know, after I've looked at that, there's still something missing, which is even though Americans in public opinion polls think they're in decline, in fact, most of the world thinks we're not. They still see us as a beacon of hope. Then 2001, we went to the opposite extreme. We went to triumphalism. You had things like Krauthammer's statement that we need a new unilateralism. We're so strong that we can do whatever we want. Others have no choice but to follow. And that got us into deep trouble. Now the pendulum is swinging back from declinism to triumphalism, back to loss of confidence and declinism. We've got to get over this. I mean, the United States is much stronger, has much greater capabilities than this, and we still can be a beacon of hope. It's interesting, for example, that a lot of people said, well, after the financial crisis, that's the end of the dollar. It's going to go tank. In fact, the dollar's gone up. People want their dollars here because they think this is the most stable economy in the long run.
So at Davos, when somebody like the historian Neil Ferguson, who is at Harvard this year, compares the United States with post-World War II Britain and says the excess of debt and the low growth rate are what did in a tired Britain, and the U.S. is facing an enormous excess of debt and low growth rates. You think that's surmountable and that others perhaps are hoping the U.S. will make it?
I think so. I think others realize that a strong and vibrant U.S. is in their interests as well. And I think the analogy to Britain after World War II is an imperfect analogy. America has much greater strength, much greater capacity than Britain did at the end of World War II.
Right. Just one other thing that has fascinated me, the term soft power has begun to be used very frequently in regard to China.
Mm-hmm.
But China's soft power is being used in a way that is very different from what you've described in your writings about the United States. People admire the United States for openness, for economic prowess, transparency, and all the qualities you've listed. But in China, its soft power is exercised by giving aid and helping with construction in countries that violate human rights immensely, places like Sudan, and they would like in Iran. Human rights, the type of government involved, is irrelevant to the Chinese, and they are winning friends and influencing people by sending out these construction teams, giving out this aid, sending tens of thousands of students abroad. So they're trying a different model of soft power. Can we compete with this model? Do you think that there's a new object of emulation, which is a state-directed system that is indifferent to democracy and human rights, but is seen to get things done?
Well, it's interesting that China has picked up the idea of soft power, and President Hu Jintao, in fact, told the 17th Party Congress that China had to invest more in its soft power. And they have done a number of things in addition to the aid programs you mentioned. They've started Confucius Institutes to promote Chinese culture overseas and done more broadcasting, brought more foreign students to China and so forth. And all these things have helped Chinese soft power. And sometimes people say, well, the new development model is the Beijing consensus, sort of authoritarian growth instead of the Washington consensus of free market growth. There are parts of the world where that works. You know, many parts of Africa where you have autocratic regimes, Sudan being a case in point. But it doesn't work to make China more attractive in, let's say, Japan or Europe or Latin America, much of Latin America, or the United States. So China's limited in how far it can go with its soft power program by the closed nature of its society and political system. And I gave a speech at Beijing University last year to a group of 500 students, and they asked me this question: how can we increase Chinese soft power? I said, open up your system. There is many talented Chinese filmmakers as there are Indian filmmakers, but the world is swamped with Bollywood movies and not with Chinese movies. And the reason is because you control your artists. So I think Chinese soft power increases. It sometimes increases most in authoritarian situations. But if it's really going to be global soft power, the Chinese are going to have to change the repressive nature of their political structure.
And just last point, if you were advising Obama, say, on the 5 key things you think he needs to do sooner rather than later to effectively exercise U.S. soft power, what would you tell him?
Well, he's already done some. I had written even before the election that announcing the closure of Guantanamo, announcing that there'll be no more torture, talking to Arab countries and Muslim countries about listening and not just lecturing. I think these are things he's already started. I would add to that trying to restructure our governmental institutions, defense and state, so that we can do more in terms of aid, and also restructure our public diplomacy so that we're not just at the spin end of that spectrum, but are on the listening and exchange part of the spectrum. Those would be the main things I think that he needs to do.
It will be interesting to watch. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Professor Nye.
Nice to chat.